My mom said more people would like the video if I wore this, so thanks, Mom. Ninja Gaiden is a beloved series that's been going on strong since the 80s due to its crazy combos, gore, and most importantly, its difficulty. But when I was a kid, I was really focused on games like Madden, Club Penguin, and one of the greatest games of all time, Polar Bowler. So because of that, I didn't really get into any M-rated titles, so I got a lot older, and even still then, I didn't really get into the Ninja Gaiden series until earlier this year when Ninja Gaiden 2 Black released on Steam. Despite me seeing myself as a casual gamer, I've heard legends of this game's difficulty, and this was just too enticing to pass up on. Not only did I play it though, I played this game on the hardest base difficulty, which for the most part turned out like this. You see the death counter right now is 0. I'll play through this whole game and it's gonna remain 0. Death. That's a death. But to add insult to injury, I also put a death counter on, so for every boss and all the hard portions of the game, I'll be totaling up all my deaths and then going through and seeing if a casual gamer can master the way of the ninja. So of course, we start the first chapter, you learn a couple things in the tutorial, which might have already had 30 deaths just starting right there, but that's where we get to our first real challenge in the game's gauntlet. Now, if you're not familiar, gauntlets are usually when you have to go through waves of enemies in order to progress through the story, so you can't really go back. It's either you fight or you die. Boy, did I do a lot of dying. But after 50 attempts, I was finally able to get through the gauntlet and unlock a weapon that will be super useful for me throughout the rest of my playthrough. After that though, there's some tutorial stuff to handle, some grunts to go through, and a tower to climb, but that brought us to our first boss in the game with Shadow Ninja Rosetsu. Honestly, going into this fight, I was a little nervous, but to my surprise, we were able to handle it in only 3 attempts, bringing us to 89 deaths at the end of the first chapter. I was feeling confident and overjoyed, which even led to me saying this: I did what I said I was going to do. 1 chapter down, I think the game has like 8, and I had like 90 deaths on just the first chapter. Well, you were off by like 9 chapters, but who was counting? Let's move on. Chapter 2 starts by introducing a new enemy type in demon dogs that are a little irritating by themselves, but when you combine them with other enemies, that's where they truly start to become annoying. So the next portion I got stuck on was another gauntlet that happens outside the castle that the chapter 2 boss is waiting in. A mixture of demon dogs up close and rocket launchers from afar made this fight feel unbearable, but after 38 attempts I was finally able to complete it, bringing us to a total of 136 deaths so far in this playthrough. Once I got into the castle, I was then met with a mini boss that was giving me problems, but in the end I was able to get through him without dying, so the only thing left to do was go to the top of the castle where the second boss and one of my greatest enemies throughout the entirety of this playthrough, Genshin, was waiting for me. I continuously tried to find angles to attack him at, but nothing was working. The deaths were starting to pile up and I was starting to run out of hope. Until I remembered that the best offense was really defense and perfect parrying was about to become my best friend. Till this point in the game, I would deflect attacks but never counter them, as it was extremely difficult to master it on this difficulty, but with no other way to beat him, I had to add a new skill in my bag if I wanted to stand any chance at beating this entire game. With that in mind, I was able to study his pattern, find an opening, and abuse it like never before, taking him down in 36 deaths and finally completing chapter 2. Headed into chapter 3, we've now landed in New York, where the apples are big but the enemies are bigger, as we're now fighting Chithulu's illegitimate children. But we breezed through the city and headed into the sewers, where my first reaction to the boss was this: what in the You tweaking, Twan! Putting the Death Megalo Flyer's nightmarish appearance aside, since it was much faster than me, majority of the fight I had to use my ranged weapon to chip away at its health, which made the fight last a lot longer than it needed to. After 10 deaths though, the silver human-faced centipede finally went down, and so does this mask. Boy, is it hot in here. Much better. In chapter 4, we find our way out of the sewers and onto the Brooklyn Bridge, where we fight the first of 2 bosses in the chapter, starting with Gaudemus, the sentient meatball. While he was a hard hitter, after 5 attempts the strategy that worked best, and I wish I was joking, was simply just hitting him in the butt. Once that was over, I was flown over to France's greatest gift since the croissant, referring to the Statue of Liberty, as the 5th boss, Alexei, the ruler of lightning, was waiting for us. Not only was he the 5th boss, he was the first of the 4 greater fiends I had to fight in this playthrough, which essentially meant he was a super boss, so you probably know where this is headed. The Ruler of Lightning didn't make things easy, as his moveset was extremely fast, and the worst of his moves was a grab that took 70% of your health. So after 28 attempts, I decided to just end the stream, which is where I made my first mistake. As I was going through the VODs to make sure I had all the streams for making this video, I realized not only did I lose the footage of me beating Alexi, I lost the entirety of the footage for chapter 5, which included me playing as another character by the name of Emoji, and the boss fight with the Black Spider Tingle twins, so our boss total might be a little off at the end. Hopefully you can accept my apology of this artistic representation of what probably happened in those chapters, and don't worry, both of these bosses will be back later in the game. Going into chapter 6, we found ourselves sitting at 267 deaths and found ourselves in what I assume is Venice, Italy, to go against the next greater fiend, Wolf, the 4-armed werewolf. On the way though, we had to make a short pit stop underground to splash around in water, because God knows Ryu's suit probably stinks after being covered in demon blood for who knows how long. After spending an hour trying to complete a puzzle because the game soft locked without me knowing, I was then met with one of the most fraudulent bosses in the entirety of gaming, in the Water Dragon. To start, the entirety of this fight took place on a tiny platform, which was bad, but was made even worse with his water slash attack taking up a majority of that platform, along with half of my health. To round out his moveset, he would also spawn ghost piranhas and icicles that would easily shred through your health if you weren't ready for them, and the cherry on top was the game once again heavily pushed me into using a ranged weapon, which didn't even work half the time even if you locked onto him. Alas, 17 deaths later, we were finally able to flush that oversized sea slinky down the drain to continue on to chapter 7. Hey, did I mention that the next boss is literally in the next room over? Oh, I didn't? Crazy. Oh yeah, no, we're fighting Gog Magog, the bone boss now. Admittedly, this boss took a while, even though it was the first boss with a weak spot, but since none of the other bosses had one, I didn't even bother looking for it until I'd already died 13 times. Once Dry Bones turned to dust, I don't know what internally happened inside of me, but everything just started to make sense as I went on an absolute tear going into what I'll call the infamous 10th stream. For the first 31 minutes of the stream, I didn't have a single death, which doesn't sound that insane, but you have to consider I haven't really showed footage of me fighting enemies in between bosses. You also have to look at the death counter, then realize I just died 14 times to Gog Magog, so taking all that into account, this is probably the best I've played up to this point. The deathless run did unfortunately come to an end at the hands of the second greater fiend, Wolf, but I still had pretty great pacing as I only died to him twice, even with the game trying to get me jumped for 5 minutes after he was already long gone. After one of Ryu's many girlfriends ended up rescuing him in a chopper, I ended up saying this, "Ooh, and I get his scythe? Ooh." Which turned out to be far more useful than I ever could have imagined, but I'm getting a few steps ahead of myself. Let's move on to chapter 8. Headed back to New York, we're introduced to our third playable character in Rachel, which I might have enjoyed playing as. Got me giggling. Off of login. Ninja never giggle. And after 3 deaths, we were able to get to the boss of this chapter in Marbus, aka Baphomet, and take him down in 5 attempts. We're flying high in chapter 9 though, as it takes place on an aircraft where we're introduced to mech enemies that made me sweat a little bit, but not enough to slow down my momentum, as I was able to take them down to 4 attempts before coming face to face with a familiar foe in Genshin. My PTSD immediately kicked in, which led to me saying, "He's been the hardest to beat so far, bro." But I just couldn't be stopped, as this was the first boss in the entire playthrough that I was able to beat without dying a single time. The chapter wasn't over yet though, as I was hit with back-to-back bosses, with Mega Camera being the second one, and he just kinda exploded halfway through his fight. Not really sure if that was supposed to happen, but nonetheless I was able to beat him after having 1 death, bringing us to a total of 5 deaths in chapter 9 altogether, which also means I was at 324 total deaths at the unofficial halfway mark of this game. Before we get into the second half, let's take a quick break to look at my death statistics to this point so far in this game. So first, looking at this Very well made chart. You can see that most of my deaths so far in this game have been at the hands of bosses outside of chapter 1 and the inconclusive chapter 5. The easiest boss to this point in the game so far was one we literally just talked about in Genshin, where I had 0 deaths, but the hardest boss in the game also was Genshin, where I had 36 deaths in our first meeting. That's what I like about Ninja Gaiden. A lot of duality going on. Keep in mind that 27% of my deaths came in the first chapter, so if we just take that out the equation, I'm averaging about 29 deaths a chapter, which isn't great, but I don't think that's awful for a first time player of the Ninja Gaiden series, especially doing it on the hardest difficulty. With all those statistics out the way though, feel free to leave a comment what you think my total death count would be at the end of this game. Without further ado, let's get into the second half of the game, starting with chapter 10. Now in a snowy terrain, we've come to track down the 3rd grader fiend Zidonius, but the mutated meatball from earlier's brother Gautamov has gotten in our way, so we have to take him out first. He was a bit tougher to take down compared to his brother due to the fact that he summoned other enemies, but after 15 deaths, I buried him in the snow and got ready to go face my true challenge. Now going into boss fights, I'm usually pretty well prepared, but before this I spent all my money upgrading my weapon, so I had nothing to rely on but my skills, as there was no crutch that was going to save me this time. Throughout this playthrough I realized my biggest weaknesses were flying bosses, fast bosses, and bosses with summons. So you could imagine combining all 3 of those things into one boss felt like I was facing my biggest nightmare. The biggest obstacle for this fight specifically though was when he would summon 3 enemies at a time and I could only attack 2 as I didn't have my Nympho, which is my magical ninja power, at a high enough level, so there was always one left over that made the fight infinitely harder. So 10 deaths turned to 20, 20 turned to 40, 40 turned to 70, and then finally...
That's perfectly fine. Just don't go up in the air again. Please don't go in the air again. Please don't go in the air again. Oh my fucking god, bro.
78 deaths later, Zidonius was slain. After 2.5 hours of getting physically, mentally, and emotionally destroyed, I decided to call it a night after that fight and got ready to continue to chapter 11 the next day. In chapter 11, we find ourselves back in Italy with our final playable character in Ione, as she's there to track down the Fiend Witch who stole an important relic to Ryu's family's dragon bloodline. It wasn't that hard to snatch it off her though, as we were able to get it back and get back on track after taking her down in 4 attempts. For chapter 12, we are then thrown into the jungle where I met a really cool enemy that had a chainsaw for one hand and a cannon for the other. Didn't really give me any problems or anything, but I just thought he had one of the best base designs in the entire game out of all the enemies, so shout out to him. After slashing through vines and foes though, I ended up at the end of the jungle where the dark dragon was waiting for me. Unlike his stupid water counterpart, this fight was nowhere near as annoying, as I was able to clear it after 8 attempts to bring us to the underworld for our final act that starts in chapter 13. The level doesn't start off that bad, being just a casual walk in a park, but that walk was quickly brought to a halt when I was introduced to the absolute hardest part in the game, in which I'm referring to the stairway to hell. Now I'll start by showing you how many total deaths I had in this fight. Doesn't look that bad, right? But what if I told you this fight took me 3 hours to complete? And for those of you keeping track at home, Zidonius took me 2.5 hours in a fight that I died 77 times on. Now to be honest, I've heard this game is easier than some of the original games, and I'm not here to argue about that, but what I will tell you is this staircase is 1000% harder than it was in Ninja Gaiden 2, because a month after this game released, they put out a patch that specifically increased the number of enemies on this staircase. So I'd 100% consider this fight worse than Zidonius because it just turned into an absolute war of attrition. Through hundreds of waves of enemies, you had to hack and slash and pray your way through, and you had very little breaks in between. Oh, and if you died, good luck, because it would take about 9 minutes for each run if you wanted to get back to the point where you were previously at. Even though it seemed completely hopeless, thankfully I had 2 saving graces. Remember that scythe I got back in chapter 7? Each weapon has its own special charge abilities, and thankfully the scythe had the right amount of damage and area coverage to mow through tons of enemies at once. The other thing that was a massive help was the Talisman of Rebirth. It basically acted as a revive, so anytime I died I could just use it to keep on fighting, and I knew I wasn't going to get through the staircase without it. So if you feel that makes my run any less valid, why don't you come say something to me, huh? Why don't you come say something? Cause I think you should go. Once I climbed to the top and wiped my tears of joy, I saved and got ready to go against the last of the 4 greater fiends in Elizabeth, the ruler of blood. From a technical standpoint, she was pretty hard to fight as it was difficult to close the gap between me and her. She was extremely quick, my range attacks weren't hitting, and on top of all of that, she had a move that would steal health from me in order to heal herself. But I ended up making things easier on myself by cornering her to slow down her movements, which helped me flush her down the blood toilet in 7 attempts. Chapter 14 starts with me going back to a familiar area in Joe Hayabusa's castle where we fought Genshin in Chapter 2, where I was immediately met with a gauntlet that took me 22 attempts I'd rather not speak more about. After that was handled, I did another repeat boss in the Black Spider Tengu twins who I fought in the lost footage of Chapter 5, but unfortunately this time around they had way less health than they did when they were main bosses, so I was able to take them out in 2 attempts. A little training and 2 gauntlets later, I was once again faced with an old man who just doesn't know how to quit as we're fighting Genshin for the 3rd time. Unfortunately this time around though, I wasn't able to perfect him like I did in the 2nd time, but I still beat him in 5 attempts, which I'm not too mad at. Once that was handled, we were headed to our final location in the game, into a twisted Mount Fuji. Not gonna lie, chapter 15 kinda felt like the game ran out of new things to show me, so I'll be going against 3 bosses again for the 2nd time. We first start with Marbus, who we originally fought in Rachel in New York, so this is Ryu's first time fighting him, and Ryu's moveset is way superior to Rachel, so we were able to get it from 4 deaths in the first fight down to 2 in this one. Next up was a fight I was kinda eager to do for a 2nd time, even though this boss beat the absolute brakes off of me, in which I'm talking about Zidonius. I don't know if it's a masochist thing or a mentality thing, but even though his moveset and mine didn't change since the last fight, I was able to get it to go from 77 deaths down to just 4. And the final boss this chapter I had to offer was Volk, which was the only boss that my death count went up in, starting at 2, going all the way up to a terrifying 3. We walk into the heart of Mount Fuji for the penultimate chapter 16, where we're faced with the Tengu twins for a 3rd time, but they were still pretty easy to get through as I was able to beat them without a scratch. The next boss we fought for the 2nd time was Alexei, the ruler of lightning, and thankfully I had the footage of me beating him this time. His 2nd phase, where he dashes 3 straight times, was kind of a headache, but I overcame it after 7 deaths, leaving us with 1 final chapter left in this game. For the final stretch, we are met with the enemy we know all too well in Genshin that we'll be fighting for the last time. While his moveset did evolve on 3 separate occasions, his strength in the first fight became his weakness in the last, as I was able to lay him to rest without dying a single time. As he was going to give me his weapon to use against evil as his last wish, Elizabeth came to ruin the party, as now I had to fight her for the 2nd time in this back-to-back boss battle. Although the game really wanted me to use the dual blades it just gave me, I had a lot more success with the greatsword, so I ended up sticking with that and using my cornering strat to beat her to dust in just 7 attempts. Our next order of business was trying to stop the priest from reviving the Archfiend, which we were a little too late to do, so now we had to fight Dagradai in order to get to the final boss. I feel like the devs genuinely tried to make this boss hard, but for whatever reason the difficulty wasn't mentally registering to me, so I was able to get through him without dying, so we have one last boss to beat before we beat the entire game. While the Archfiend was just another 2-stage boss, what made him unique was that his fight was separated into 2 separate locations. The first location took place at the bottom of the volcano, which wasn't that bad as I only died once, but the second location came when he started to climb the volcano, where his attacks were slightly faster and did a bit more damage, but after dying twice and almost 3 times, I finally just did this. That's so embarrassing. Oh, I still have the Talisman of Rebirth. Okay. Yeah, let's end this fight. Let's end this game. In the least anticlimactic fashion ever. Say hello to my little friend. Like, y'all went through all that trouble to revive this. This was your man's. And with that, the day is saved, the game is over, and the final death count sat at... Wait, no. Wait, no, please, no! I thought it was all... So he had a second form. Normally, this wouldn't be a big deal, but remember when I literally just used that Talisman of Rebirth for absolutely no reason because I thought the game was over? Well, since I did that, I'm coming into this actual final boss fight with no health and no revives. So, in a very poetic way, this final fight is a true testament to see if I have learned anything throughout this entire playthrough. His moveset mainly consisted of Zidonius and Alexi's abilities with his own special beam cannon thrown into the mix. At first I struggled to find somewhere to attack him because he would send barrages of attacks, but even when I did find a weak point, it was short-lived and barely did any damage. So death after death, I sat and attacked patiently, just waiting for any sort of lifeline. And then, it happened.
Ryu, you are selling the bag something crazy right now. This is not supposed to be happening. Oh, Ryu, you sold the bag so bad.
By complete accident, this game gave me an opportunity to do what I've been waiting to do all day to a boss. Just simply hack and slash. While I low-key sold and didn't do as much damage as I hoped to do, I wasn't going to let this opportunity go to waste, and with all the pressure on, it came down to this.
There we go. Hit him with that finisher, Ryu. Hit him with that finisher, Ryu. Jesus Christ. Like, that was a freebie. He 1000% got stuck, and that was not supposed to happen. But we made work of it, though. And he ore farms in the middle of a volcano. Gotta love Ryu, man.
And just like that, it was finally over. For real this time, as I successfully beat my first ever Ninja Gaiden game on the hardest base difficulty to master the way of the ninja. So, looking at the statistics, after 47 hours of gameplay, I died a total of 555 times, with the estimated minimum of 273 of those deaths being at the hands of bosses. There are 4 bosses I perfected, 2 being Genshin and Genshin 2 and 4, and the others being Dagger Dai and Gyuki, the Chapter 2 mini-boss. But the 3 bosses I struggled the most with were Genshin 1, Alexi, and Zidonius, coming in for a total of at least 142 of my deaths throughout this playthrough. Sure, the camera was bad, the difficulty curve was brutal, and the game's optimization almost turned my computer into an ID, but the gameplay was great, which is all I could really ask for in the end. So despite how people may feel about the remake, I'm personally glad it was one of the first Ninja Gaiden titles I ended up playing. With that being said, I don't know when I'm going to play the rest of the Ninja Gaiden series, but I will say this as a closing thought. Ryu Hayabusa is one of the greatest ninjas to ever do it. But I'm King Crown Slice, hope you like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.